Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this special edition of the Sunday Wire. We're streaming live on the X platform, also on YouTube and on Facebook at 21wire.tv. Thank you for joining us. We had a bit of a delay because of a technical difficulty, which we've resolved. Thank you very much for rejoining the stream. We're going to be joined by a couple of special guests in just a moment. Before we connect them, we'll just give you a little bit of a prelude to what we'll be covering today. We're going to be doing a deep dive on the situation in the Middle East. Specifically, we're going to be talking about not only the situation in Palestine, but also the emerging situation regarding Yemen and the United States. Another war appears to have been announced. At least Washington appears to have declared war and their allies on Yemen. We'll talk about that, what it means, look at the overall strategic situation in the region, what it means, and we'll do that in detail in just a moment. And we're going to be welcoming a couple of special guests, journalists from the Middle East. Leila Hatoum is going to be joining us as well, and Yousef Mawry is going to be joining us from Yemen as well on the live link. We'll be connecting them shortly. And also, thank you for joining us on the stream and everybody in the 21st Century Wire chat room. Good to see you guys in there. Again, apologies for the delay. So we'll be bringing onto the stage our guests now as we welcome them onto the program. Let me bring on Leila Hatoum first, who's joining us live right now from Central Asia or somewhere in the Asian subcontinent. Leila, thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, and it's always nice to see you again. Central Asia it is. I'm in Pakistan at the moment, and I'm going back to the southern Lebanese front tomorrow.
Okay, so yes, you are very busy indeed, Leila, and we'll talk more about that. Let me also welcome to the program Yousef Mawry is joining us right now from the capital of Yemen in Sana'a. Thank you very much, Yousef, for joining us on the Sunday Wire today.
My pleasure. It's good to be here.
Thank you, both of you. So let's get right to it. The situation at hand right now, over the last week, things have changed. Things have changed somewhat, but they've changed, but they haven't changed as well. It's still the same situation. Leila, I want to give you a chance to give your summary of the current situation report as it stands right now. You can comment, of course, on Palestine, Gaza. I know you've been covering this at a conference recently as well, so do share your thoughts with us there. And then also tell us your assessment right now of the situation between Washington, its allies, and Yemen as it stands. Go ahead, Leila.
Fair enough. I want to start with basically the general front. I'm calling it the general front, which is basically Gaza and the West Bank. Israelis continue to ramp up their attacks against Palestinians. There are over 24,000 people killed if you actually calculate those who are missing. So we're reaching around 30,000, 31,000 people in Gaza alone. In the West Bank, we have approached the 400 death threshold. We're at around 380 Palestinians killed by the Israelis. Remember that in 2022, the Israelis killed around 240 to 250 Palestinians, both in Gaza and the West Bank. So nearly 380 to 400 Palestinians killed in the West Bank alone. That tells you how much evil doing is happening on the ground by the Israelis, the Israeli occupation against Palestinians. And that's not Hamas. Hamas is in Gaza, it's not in the West Bank. However, the Palestinians have taken to the streets in Jenin, in Nablus, in Tol Karim, in Ramallah, even in Bethlehem, fighting back against illegal Israeli settlers who are armed to the teeth. They were armed by radical movements and radical ministers in Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet, like Avigdor, not Avigdor Lieberman. Avigdor Lieberman is one of the radicals, but the current minister is basically Itamar Ben-Gvir. And basically you have Smotrich, the finance minister. When it comes to Gaza, you have 12 Israeli soldiers killed last night by attacks when it comes to Islamic Jihad and Hamas, the resistance group on the ground fighting the Israeli occupation. At the same time, you have over 34 Israelis wounded yesterday. Most of them are in critical and medium injuries. When it comes to the southern Lebanese front, these numbers, you're not going to hear them today or tomorrow. The Israelis will continue to deny, and towards the end of the week, you'll start hearing the numbers. and they start releasing them. Remember, over a week ago, I said that the Israeli occupation forces have sustained, remember this, they have sustained over 4,000 disabled soldiers because of Gaza and the Northern Front. The Israelis went out to deny that. 2 days ago, the Israelis actually confessed to having 4,000 disabled soldiers because of this current war that's happening both on the Northern Front, which is basically Gaza, which is Lebanon, and the Southern Front, which is Gaza. Now, to move to Lebanon, the Israelis continue to pound Lebanese towns and cities. They're targeting civilian areas. They're still using phosphorus bombs. They're using their drones and their airstrikes as well. But you have to remember one thing. This is all just a show of force to cover up for all the failures that they have done. They are yet to be able to push Hezbollah beyond the Northern Litani front. Hezbollah continues to retaliate not only against the frontline settlements of the Blue Line, but also settlements beyond, all the way to the command center, and even including Safad. Safad is a town that's basically critical to the Israelis because it has all the facilities that support Mount Meron's air defense system for the Israelis over there that was hit by Hezbollah earlier last week. And at the same time, it's close to the command ship, which is basically in Dado. That means Hezbollah at any point can launch again its missiles, and the Israelis cannot stop it because their defense system, the radar system, is flying fully blind at the moment. Most of their facilities at the air defense base, which is called the Eye in the Sky for Israel, is now partially to almost totally destroyed when it comes to the defense systems. And basically all their espionage systems along the Blue Line have been destroyed. Now, to move over to what's happening across the Middle East, you have to understand one thing. There has been a significant change from the Arab League towards the Palestinian cause. You have, for the first time, a unanimous agreement among the Arab states to support the South African litigation against Israel. And this was put out in a statement by the head of the Arab League, the Secretary General, Abu Ghait, and he actually read it to the media. This was not covered by international media as it usually does. It just passed slowly, and people didn't even know about it at one point or another, which is really sad. You have a unanimous agreement now among Arabs, finally after 4 months, and now they're basically backing South Africa and its litigation against Israel. On the other hand, when it comes to Yemen, and I'm really sorry, Yousef, you have to basically fill us in on the matter. I just heard that there was an attack on Yemen now by the Americans and the British in Lihya Mountain. It's basically Al-Gada or Jada, and that's in Hudaydah, right? If you can tell me more about it, I'd appreciate it.
So yeah, this was an attack that just happened a couple of hours ago. And the reports, we haven't gotten any reports of any casualties or what exactly was destroyed. We just know where the location was. And according to the US officials, they're looking to target radars and air defense systems. And they're trying to actually find Yemeni fighter jets, which they thought that they destroyed during the Saudi-led coalition. So, I'll go ahead and let you continue with that information.
Okay, so basically that escalation, it's not the first, it's the second actually, or the third attack by the British and the American forces against Yemen and northern Yemen, Ansar Allah Houthis basically, or the Yemeni armed forces as we call them in the media. The fact that the British have pushed to speed up the expansion of the fronts in the Middle East tells you one thing, that the whole cook, the presto cook that they have been literally doing for the past, not few months, but actually for the past 3 years, have finally reached the tipping point. And now they're moving the next front. They want to create that big explosion that allows for a move in by the British and the Americans to create that war in the Middle East, which we had spoken about earlier, if you remember, 3 months ago and 2 months ago, Patrick, during interviews. The Americans want to get in, but first they couldn't get in before they deplete the resources of the resistance, one, weaken the other fronts, and then basically try to get rid of Netanyahu when the society in Israel is divided, and that's when they walk in as heroes trying to save the day. You have to remember one thing, and that's under international law, because that's my specialty. I studied international law. When it comes to Bab el-Mandab and the international trade that passes through Bab el-Mandab, which the Americans and the Israelis and the British are trying to take as an excuse to attack Yemen, those waters are territorial waters. They are not high waters. That's the first thing. Ships that pass through there have to pay tribute to Yemen because it part of that territorial water belongs to them. And the other thing you have to understand that the Yemenis never once threatened the international trade that's going through Bab el-Mandab to the Red Sea towards basically other areas, except for the ships that are linked to Israel. So all international trade that's not linked to Israel that needs to pass through the Red Sea are passing peacefully. However, Israeli-linked ships and the ships that are basically supplying not only arms and food and oil and basically medication and other merchandise to Israel, those are the only ones that are being stopped. So talks by the US that the Yemenis are threatening international trade, this is not true. That's one thing. The second thing is that under international law, the Yemenis have declared war against Israel. So it's an act of war, it's not an act of piracy. They have the full right to cut off the supplies to their enemy. And their enemy at the moment is Israel. So again, they're not doing an act of piracy. And they have the full right to control whatever passes through their territorial waters. Remember, Bab el-Mandab at the tightest point is about 29 kilometers basically apart, which basically doesn't allow for full entrance and exit of several ships. They have to pass through the territorial waters of Yemen at one point or another.
And just on that international law question, effectively, and I want to get Yousef's comment on this as well. I'll come back to your points, Leila, as well. But Yousef, effectively, Yemen has declared sanctions. They're imposing sanctions on Israel, and they're executing those sanctions by using military force. In this case, naval force. So this isn't like, from an international law point of view, as Leila was talking about, this is completely normal. Other countries have done exactly the same thing, including the United States. What are your thoughts on this, Yousef?
Well, you know, I always use the example of this school bully who's just in class picking on every student that he can find, and he's just traumatizing and terrorizing any student. However, he gets, you know, the school bully gets to that one quiet student all the way in the back in the corner by himself, and when he tries to pick on him, he unexpectedly gets punched in the nose, and then the quiet kid becomes the class hero. This is a situation that we have with Yemen right now, where you have basically the US and the Zionist International Lobby, the Israeli government and all of their partners and their allies, who have a PhD and who have vast experience in world domination and creating this worldwide economic architecture built on exploitation of Muslim lands and military occupation. And we have a new power in Yemen. We have the new player, the new student in class, if you will, who's not going to tolerate Western hegemonic order in Yemen, and not just in Yemen, but also in the Middle East. So there's a reason why there's this double standard. There's a reason why there is this massive hypocrisy that we continue to witness on a daily basis when it comes to the U.S. and the Israeli foreign policy in the Middle East. So they can get away with genocide. They can enable genocide. They can, the U.S. can support the Israeli government with all types of weapons, illegal weapons, and just commit what seems to be active open genocide in front of the whole world to see. You know, a prominent Ansar Allah official, he mentioned in the demonstration that happened Friday, and you know, this was a demonstration that consisted of almost 3 million Yemenis who took to the streets to voice their anger at the US and the UK attacks on Yemen. And he said something that was very significant. He said that US and Israel are killing Muslims in Palestine, and this is a huge, huge insult to not just the Palestinians who are being massacred, but also to the rest of the world, and especially the Arab and Muslim world, because they're killing these people and they're expecting the Muslims and the Arabs just to sit back and watch and remain silent. So the example that the Ansar Allah or Yemen's military army is undertaking right now is they want to lead by example, and they want to set the precedence and change the paradigm in the Middle East that we no longer have to fear US, UK, and Western domination over our internal affairs. The time to fight back is now. And Yemen is ready and willing to play a leading role in leading this front to bring an end to Western hegemony in the Middle East. And it starts with first ending it in Yemen. Now that was successful because the Ansar Allah led revolution in 2014 it was supported by the mass of the Yemeni people. People when they came all the way from the northern province of Sada, it wasn't a military coup. They didn't, topple the current Saudi U.S.-backed government by military force, and that's because from their inception, from the time that they were just a small minority group in the north part of Yemen, they had and they shared and they echoed the same sentiments that was embedded in the heart of every Yemeni, and that is to establish an independent Yemeni nation that is free of all types of Western and Saudi meddling in Yemen's internal affairs. So naturally, the free people of Yemen, they responded to this call and they supported this political struggle, which eventually turned into a military struggle because, as it turned out, the Saudi-led coalition was actually put together by the UN Council and the U.S. and they put together this powerful coalition force and gave them all types of weapons in order to quell the anti-Western revolution in Yemen. They did this for 9 years, from 2015 all the way until 2022. They bombed every single province in Yemen. They dropped 1/3 bombs on Yemen, 1/3 bombs on Yemen, in order to try to bring back Yemen into the shackles of the Western powers. They failed drastically. They failed across the board. And this is why the Yemeni people, as it stands today, what didn't kill them only made them stronger. So what else can the U.S. and honestly, these military operations that have been conducted by the U.S. and the UK Army, the Yemeni people are looking at it as a joke because, like I said, they've already experienced 1/3 bombs being dropped on Yemen. Yemenis have already experienced, one of the world's worst strangling blockades, which led Yemen into becoming the world's worst humanitarian crisis, something that hasn't happened in modern time. So if the Yemeni people or any group of people are able to overcome all of these struggles and all of these challenges for the sole purpose of ending Western domination over Yemen's internal affairs, and they've succeeded drastically. They've succeeded across the board when it comes to establishing an independent Yemeni nation that is built upon national sovereignty and protecting the sentiments and the interests of the Yemeni people. But it doesn't end there, because here's the fact. The fact is, Patrick, Yemen and the Ansarullah movement, their main objective is not just to rid the Western domination over Yemen's internal affairs. Ansarullah has an Islamic goal, an Islamic objective to rid not just Yemen, but the rest of the Muslim world from Western supervision. And at the top of the list is freeing the Palestinian people from this 75 to 80 years of Israeli occupation. Now, in 2015, and this I'll make it short. In 2015, this is when the Ansarullah movement was a small minority group all the way in the north, province of Sada. Nobody had ever heard of them. It was just about, I would say, 10,000 followers. I went there to conduct interviews with some of their members. And remember, Sada was destroyed by Saudi Arabia and the U.S.-backed Yemeni government, because when they first launched this Ansarullah movement, their slogans were, were prefaced upon bringing an end to Western domination. So because of that, the country's Saudi Arabian and Yemeni government waged war on them. And I went there during that time, and something still stands with me today that I experienced over there. And that is, in the midst of the destruction and the chaos and the strangling blockade that the people that the Ansarullah movement experienced in North Yemen, when I was conducting interviews with them, asking them, what is your goal? They always mentioned the Palestinian cause. They always mentioned liberating the holy land of Al-Aqsa and confronting the Israeli regime. And this was back in 2011, where the only weapons they had were the AK-47s that they carried on their back. So, to make a long story short, this movement is a movement unlike any other movement. They have a leader unlike any other leader that we've experienced and witnessed in modern time. They're really serious about liberating the land of Palestine, and they're not just talking about it, they're doing it as we speak.
So, and Yousef, just to be clear, the condemnation coming from Western leaders like the Foreign Secretary of the UK, David Cameron, saying what the Houthis, they use the term Houthis, you might comment on that as well. What is the correct term to use? Because I know the Western media like to, narrow the frame of reference to Hamas, to Houthis, etc., in order to kind of contain the narrative a little bit. But he's saying it's wrong, it's illegal, etc. But they've been very clear, until there's a ceasefire, until the genocide stops in Gaza, then they will continue to interdict Israeli shipping on the high seas. Again, a form of sanctions enforced by hard power. So, and nobody's talking about this in the West, saying, hey, maybe we should come to the negotiation table. Isn't it true, Yousef, that 30 or 40 years ago, even the Americans would have been negotiating with the Yemenis over this? But in the new international environment, there is no diplomacy. There are no negotiations. What do you think that's a fair assessment? And what would your response be to the accusations and the failure to address the cause of this action by Yemen? Go ahead, Yousef.
So I think the U.S. and the Israeli international lobby, they know who they're dealing with. And in fact, they know who Ansar Allah, or as they like to call them, the Houthis, they know who they are. They know what their goals are. So when we talk about negotiations, what is there to negotiate with Ansar Allah? The U.S. has already tried to negotiate with Ansar Allah. They've already tried to compromise with Ansar Allah. They've tried to actually put forward proposals to the Ansar Allah government, ensuring that Yemen will never have to experience what they've experienced in 9 years of war. Yemen will be free of any sanctions, yada, yada, yada. And still, all of these proposals, all of these compromises by the U.S. were rejected by Yemen's Ansar Allah movement because their ideological goals stems from their doctrine, their Islamic doctrine, which is which obliges them to help out and liberate the land of Al-Aqsa. So the U.S. and the British and the Western world, they realize that this is a movement where there's no point of negotiating with them. If we negotiate with them and we establish a long ceasefire, they're only going to use that ceasefire to develop and get stronger militarily, as was the case in 8 years of war. Every time there was a ceasefire, the Ansar Allah movement, or even without a ceasefire, Ansar Allah movement, under the dust of the destruction and chaos, they were still able to develop a capable ballistic missile system, one of the most powerful systems in the region. So the U.S. now is at the cornerstone of history where they realize that the only way to deal with the Ansar Allah movement in order to maintain U.S. supervision in this part of the world, in order for the U.S. to maintain its control of Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea, the only option on the table for them is to declare war and rally up all of the coalition forces under their wing, Israel, the UK, Australia, Italy, and all of these NATO forces, to wage war on Yemen, because this is the only way that, through their scope, that they can end the threat of their domination of the Middle East being jeopardized or coming to an end. So when you talk about negotiations with the Americans or with the British or with any other Western powers, what you're basically asking them to do is to withdraw their military bases and to end their military occupation and extortion of the Middle East. And that's not something that they are willing to do through negotiations.
And Leila, you mentioned something I think that was a critical development. You're talking about the stance of the Arab League and also the GCC countries regarding this issue. First, I want to talk about two things. One is the political dimension. How significant is it? Because some critics have said, oh, nothing's going to happen with the ICJ, International Courts of Justice. South Africa is going to make a good case. Israel is going to give you the usual propaganda, and nothing's going to happen as a result. But I think actually, no, there's actually a powerful political signal that is a global signal as well, that is actually significant. Can you comment on the events in The Hague this week and what they mean, especially as it relates to what you said about how giving a sort of a platform for other countries to rally on in support of Palestine going forward. What sort of a different environment are we looking at as a result of this, Leila?
Uh, let's start with this one line. If it's that insignificant, then why are the Israelis afraid? Why is Netanyahu threatening and then basically shouting that even if the ICJ takes a decision, even if the world stands against us, we will continue? Those are the empty words of somebody who's afraid. He has nothing to pull out of his sleeve anymore. So basically, he resorts to saying, like, I'm nonchalant, I don't care, I have impunity, and I will go on. What happened in reality is that the international community came together. I mean, like, we're not talking about 197 states, but we're talking about at least a significant number of states who, if they did not support South Africa actually within the court, they're being vocal against those atrocities that are being committed by the Israelis. And now, with the move of the 22 countries within the Arab League, that includes the GCC nations, that tells you one thing: the Arabs have unified their stand, which means soon enough we will be seeing 57 OIC members, Organization of Islamic Countries, also joining that stand. We've seen more and more countries joining South Africa in its litigation against the Israeli entity in The Hague at the ICJ level. And at the same time, don't forget, the Israelis are taking it seriously, despite the fact that they are playing it cool, because they have sent their team to the ICJ to basically retaliate to the claims and the litigation that has been brought against them. However, we saw throughout this past week, I mean, it was hilarious. That was a shame, to have somebody go and defend an entity without being prepared for it. You saw South Africa giving one evidence after the other, one legal argument after the other, citing one international law after the other, citing precedents one after the other. They're very well prepared for that. Whereas the Israelis, they only had one line: they hate Jews, they're attacking us because of Jews, Judaism, etc. They have no legal defense, they have no proof, and if at any point somebody counters them, they call them anti-Semite. And if they can't counter, they lose the paper, like we saw with their lawyer. Such a shame. I mean, at the end of the day, this is an entity that had governed international media and public opinion for the longest time. And finally, the mask is off. And I've always said this line: you can fool some of the people all the time, all of the people some of the time, but not all of the people all of the time. Israel's mask is off. The public opinion across the world, including in the US, has changed drastically against the Israelis. The governments who are still basically supporting the Israeli entity at one point or another with its genocide that's being committed against the Palestinians, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, because we shouldn't be forgetting about the West Bank that's currently facing international media blackout, despite the atrocities that are being committed over there. Finally, the international community is coming together against that one spoiled brat child that has been pampered for the longest time, given impunity over every single atrocity that it has committed, and now enough is enough. This is what's important. And I want to add something that to what Yousef had said. There is a unification when it comes to the resistance fronts across the Middle East. Today, there was a speech by Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's Secretary General. He went out and he said one thing: the Americans and the British are trying to bring over war. We don't care if they come in. They will be met with the same stance, not only from Lebanon, but also from Yemen, from Syria, from Iraq, and from Palestine. It is up to them to end the war and end they bring forward ceasefire when it comes to Gaza. And after that, we will speak. We will not speak to anybody before they end this attack on Gazans. So there's a unified front on this matter.
And also, Leila, in terms of the support from the Gulf states regarding Yemen right now, we have seen very cautious statements from the Saudis on this. They're not, they don't seem to be behind this effort by the United States, certainly not enthusiastically at all. And so is it a case that Saudi Arabia is just not interested in getting back into a conflict, heavy fighting with the Yemenis? How would you read this? And also, where's the UAE on this issue right now as things are flaring up near the Red Sea?
We were just discussing this matter earlier today during the conference I'm attending in Pakistan at the moment in Lahore. And I had told the audience one thing when they asked me about Saudi Arabia's stand and the GCC states. I said, you have to understand, when it comes to Hamas, it's being funded by the Muslim Brotherhood at one point or another, which is considered a terrorist organization for the GCC nations. So that's why basically they were one step, should we basically back Hamas or just the Palestinian people? And it took some time. However, the Saudi stand when it comes to Yemen is a completely different issue. They have signed an agreement with the Iranians with the blessings of basically that's brokered by the Chinese. At the same time, the Saudis for the past 2 years have been looking for a political solution with Ansar Allah al-Houthis in Yemen, and they've engaged in negotiations with them and they've reached a truce. So currently there's a truce along the borders between northern Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And I don't believe at any point that the Saudi stand would change towards basically achieving that peace or a longer truce with the Houthis in favor of the Americans. At the end of the day, the Saudis and the Americans don't see eye to eye, especially with this administration, the Democrats. If it were a Republican administration, I would have told you they might have spoken together. Don't forget also one thing, that the Biden administration with its media have been trying to cast a dark light against the Saudis, trying to insinuate that they are going towards basically what you call normalizing ties with the Israelis, that they don't mind basically going into fight with the Houthis, that they have shot down Houthis drones and missiles. But you have to understand one thing, the Saudis never retaliated to the Americans. They kept calm because they already know what kind of an agreement they have with the Houthis. They know what kind of an agreement they have with the Iranians, and they're not going to jeopardize that. The Americans try to insinuate that Saudis are their mailbox. They send letters to the Iranians, and the Saudis were never a mailbox to anybody, especially for the Americans. When they were actually visited Iran over a week ago or 2 weeks ago, they were actually negotiating or discussing what's happening in the region, how they can unify their stand, and what kind of relations they want going forward, built on that agreement that was brokered by the Chinese. This is what's killing the Americans. They wanted the Saudis to support them on this matter. However, it's the Americans who have pushed away their Saudi ally towards China. And when it comes to Yemen, they are not going to open that front again because they have closed it and they're going towards a political solution.
And also, Yousef, if you could, to give people a little bit of an understanding here, we're going to put a map up on screen of Yemen, and excuse the reference, it's The Economist, not my favorite publication. But just from the geography here, to explain to people what the war was over the last 9 years. Many people will look at this objectively and say this was an attempt to partition Yemen, to break up the country, to weaken the country, and ultimately to gain control of the waterway, as has been done by the creation of other new states on the African side, thus taking the coastline away from Ethiopia. Were there similar geopolitical games at play here with Yemen, Yousef? And just explain how this country is currently divided, where it stands right now. Go ahead, Yousef.
That's a very good question. And in 2012, the U.S. and the British government, along with the Gulf states, they initiated and spearheaded the process of a national dialogue conference in Yemen. And, this was after the revolution in Yemen, right, that toppled the regime of Ali Abdullah Saleh. So this was a 9-month national dialogue conference that consisted of all of the Yemeni political factions, including the Ansar Allah Houthis, including the Southern Separatists, including the Muslim Brotherhood, including the People's General Congress, which was the previous ruling party. And all of these groups, which had conflicts and went through wars with one another, they were joined together in this 9-month dialogue process. And this was a dialogue process that, I was covering this dialogue process, and the whole purpose of it, in a nutshell, was to reach an outcome and a new Yemeni constitution that would divide the entirety of Yemen into 6 federal states. 6 federal states. And this federal system, that it was being pushed by the US, by the French and the British government. And this was the intended plan. The outcomes of the National Dialogue Conference were already written. And the whole 9-month process of these political factions negotiating was just a cosmetic show. It was just a cosmetic display to show the world that, the Yemeni people, they chose to divide their nation into 6 different federal states. This was a U.S., British, and a French plan. In fact, there was a French expert in the middle of the National Dialogue Conference who I interviewed, and he was basically there as the expert on how to divide Yemen's natural resources between between its geography, which federal state should have possession of the oil, which federal state should have command of the gas, the oil, the fishing industry, and other natural resources. And this was a very, very insidious process to divide Yemen peacefully. And this is where the Ansar Allah revolution then came into play. The Ansar Allah movement was the only group within this dialogue process that said, wait a minute, this is an external plot to divide our country, something we agreed would never, ever happen. And because of that clear violation of the Yemeni constitution and that clear violation of the natural dialogue process, Ansar Allah protested, which eventually started a war. That's how the Saudi-led coalition, and that's why the Saudi-led coalition was formed, is because the Ansar Allah movement refused to divide Yemen into 6 different entities. Of course, as history has proven, Ansar Allah was proven to be victorious, and Yemen, even though it's still tentative, it still remains a one state. Now, to address the second point of your question, where does Yemen stand right now? And if you could bring up that map again, as you can see, the Ansar Allah movement, they control the orange part, and that's basically most of the Yemeni provinces. Most of the Yemeni provinces that consist of most of the population, it exists in the orange area, which are under the control of Ansar Allah. Now, all of these other factions, the STC and its allies, the Islah, and the other mixed groups, all of those political parties, they were the same ones who were in favor of dividing Yemen, and they were the ones who were taking their orders and instructions from the White House or from the Saudi embassy. This is according to Ansar Allah officials, of course. And the reason why they're at war with Ansar Allah, I mean, you can't really make this stuff up. The reason why they are at war with Ansar Allah is it because Ansar Allah refused to divide Yemen into 6 different entities? Is it because Ansar Allah, they have this malicious political ideology that seeks to, dominate Yemen's internal affairs? No. Ansar Allah is basically telling all these political factions to lay down their arms and join the formation of a transitional government, whereby even the president himself of Yemen would not be associated with the Ansar Allah movement. So yes, the country right now, it remains divided. However, the bulk of the population and the bulk of the provinces, they remain under the control of Ansar Allah. What remains of Yemen in the province of Marib, in the southern parts of Yemen, you have Hadr al-Maut, al-Mukalla. All of these factions are being supported by the US, by the UAE, by Saudi Arabia, and by the British government. And this is very clear. They're not even ashamed to admit this. If you look at in the port of Hodeidah, or not the port of Hodeidah, the port of Al-Mukha, this is where Tariq al-Affash, the cousin of the previous ruler of Yemen, he's in control of the port of Mukha, which is in the southern parts of Al-Hodeidah. And they are currently, facing clashes with Ansar Allah military units in that part of the world. All of his support and all of his military support is coming from the UAE. The UAE, if we look at the island of Socotra, and it's shown there on the map, that island is currently under the occupation of the UAE. The Emirates controls the island of Socotra. The Emirates also controls the island of Mayun. So the question is, who is opposing this military occupation of Yemen? Well, it's not the other factions of Yemen. The only ones who are opposing external military occupation is the Ansar Allah movement. And because they're resisting this military occupation, all of these factions that are being supported and sponsored from Western nations, they're getting the orders to continue to wage war against the Ansar Allah movement. So it's very, very complicated internal issue when it comes to Yemen and the other political factions. But I think what needs to be addressed is that the people of Yemen, they need to decide their own internal affairs. And the question should be, which party from that map that you showed, those factions, which of these groups represents no Western intervention in Yemen, no Saudi intervention, no meddling in Yemen's internal affairs? If you look at all of the other factions, aside from the Ansar Allah movement, and this is not hidden, they're being financed and supported from external powers.
So this isn't this is not unlike what they've done to Libya to try to divide it into three pieces, a dysfunctional country with a transnational council. I noticed they're using the same terminology for the south of Yemen, but when we see the area around Aden here, so strategically valuable, and Mansour al-Hadi, I like to kind of refer to him, Yousef and Leila, as the Juan Guaido of this story here. They've just basically decided, hey, we're going to appoint your president. This is who we recognize, even though he wasn't the legitimate president. But they say this is Washington's president, London's president, Saudi Arabia backed this as well. So really, what they're attempting to do here is is it not to just completely control the Bab el-Mandeb Straits? Because we have all these, we have Eritrea, we have Djibouti. Djibouti is a military base de facto for the West, for the most part. Socotra, it looks like the U.S., the British, the Emiratis will not give that up. They want to occupy that permanently. So it looks like there is a move to make this a dysfunctional country, to divide it and ultimately partition it, and then militarize this whole region here. Just briefly, Yousef, do you see that as a long-term plan, and what are their chances of success?
Well, I think their chances of success is not very good. And the reason for that is because the only way for them to have been successful is if they would have destroyed the Ansar Allah movement, if they would have been able to retake control of the Yemeni capital and retake control of the majority of provinces under the control of Ansar Allah. So I think that plan, the first phase of this plan has phased. But, I think I sent you the link to the interview I did in 2001 where I mentioned that because the Saudi-led coalition, these Arab states have failed across the board to rid Yemen from the Ansar Allah movement, pretty soon the U.S. is going to form a NATO-like coalition to try and get the job done, right? And this is what we are seeing unfold right now. This is, this war that's taking place in Yemen. It's not just because of the Palestinian, what's happening in Gaza. It was going to happen sooner or later, because at the end of the day, the U.S. will not give up control of Yemen, will not give up control of Bab el-Mandeb, and will not give up control of the Red Sea. And they need Yemen because Yemen is a strategic base for Western domination. And also Saudi Arabia is not that comfortable with Yemen being under the control of another, of a faction that's not loyal to the U.S., just as they are. Even though there's a ceasefire right now, even though tensions are de-escalating between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, we have to really pinpoint the fundamental struggle and the fundamental reasoning behind the U.S. deciding to launch a war on Yemen. They will not tolerate Yemen being under the control of any other party that's not loyal to Western powers, especially if the Ansar Allah movement have an objective to liberate the land of Palestine. So it becomes a situation, if you're taking part in these U.S. intelligence gatherings and discussions, at the end of the day at the round table, what are they really discussing when it comes to Yemen? I'll tell you what they're discussing. They understand very well that the Ansar Allah movement, the more it remains in power, the more power they will gain, and the more of Yemen they will take control of. And pretty soon, Yemen is going to become perhaps one of the most powerful nations in the region. And becoming one of the most powerful nations in the region means that they will have a foreign policy that will undermine Western hegemony in the Middle East. And they will seek ways to undercut U.S. and Israel's military options in the Middle East. And that's something that Ansar Allah has announced and have made very clear. Like I said, from day one, all the way from back in 2011, while this was still a small minority group movement that only possessed the AK-47s that they carry on their back, the Palestinian cause was always always embedded into the fabric of that society and into the blood that flows through their veins. So taking control of all of Yemen is just the vehicle to get them to their final destination, which is in the land of Al-Aqsa.
Thank you, Yousef. And Leila, you've also, in addition to covering the wars, you've also covered the economic markets in the region, and you're very familiar with commodities, especially the oil market, the LNG market. Two things I want to ask you on this. With this latest development with Yemen and the United States, we do have a large shipments of Qatari LNG, which is destined for Europe, for the European market. That's a big market for Qatar. The rerouting of this surely will change the price for the Europeans. How disruptive will this be for the seaborne LNG market? And people talk about the Straits of Hormuz a lot over the years. What if Iran closed the Straits of Hormuz? This would cause an oil shock that would rock the global markets and petroleum. But now we have another choke point here that people maybe weren't talking about so much 10 years ago. So in terms of oil and gas, how would you read this situation? What potential pitfalls, what potential obstacles might appear? How will the markets be affected? What have you heard on this recently?
Well, you have to understand, just like any commodity, oil and gas, much like basically other commodities, are also impacted by geopolitical stresses, so wars. Those commodities have the fear factor also controlling their prices, but not for the longest time. Whenever a war extends for a longer time, the prices go back to normal and they go back to the fundamentals, which is supply and demand. You have to understand there's no threat on the oil and gas supply across the world that passes through Bab el-Mandab unless it's going to Israel, unless it's going to Israeli ports, or unless it's basically going to supply Israeli companies, shipments, etc. So any LNG or oil tankers that are going, be it from Qatar or anywhere else across the world, going through Bab el-Mandab to the Red Sea and other places to Europe, those will not be targeted, and they have not been targeted by the Yemenis. You have to understand one thing. Until today, all the ships that the Yemenis have taken so far were linked to Israel, or they were deterred from going through Bab el-Mandab. They were linked to Israel, and not a single person was killed when those ships were stopped or basically pulled back towards Yemen. That tells you one thing: good intentions in terms of not targeting other international trade, including oil and gas, that doesn't have to do with Israel. And the second thing is that they're not harming a single person because they're not doing acts of piracy. They're not thugs. At the end of the day, they are in a state of war, and they're trying basically to cut supply from the enemy alone and not anybody else. So if the prices at any point go up because of the fear factor and the hype in the market, the prices will not go up for long unless some other geopolitical factor interferes. And in that sense, we're talking about an expanded front to support Al-Aqsa opens, be it in Lebanon or Yemen or even Iraq. You never know, because Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah today said that all the fronts are united on this matter to stop the fire and the attack against Gaza. And you have to understand one thing: Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah actually issued a threat today during his speech. He said a vital line. He said, "We will not be deterred by anything. We have been prepared for this for the past 99 days. We will go on into this war if they want to. There will be no ceilings for us and no margins. And any American target in the region is basically fair game for us." So it's not only going to attack basically the Israelis. Americans' interests in the region will be attacked. And that alone would cause a flare-up in the prices of commodities, including oil and gas. Strait of Hormuz can be stopped, like it can be blocked at any point by Iran. They've tried to do it in the past. However, you have to understand two things. UAE has its shorelines also on the Arabian Sea through Khor-Fakkan and Sharjah. And at the same time, they can pull things through land to the other side of the Red Sea, which is basically Saudi Arabia. And from there, they can take it through Suez Canal to the Mediterranean and Europe. So it's literally not a matter of disrupting that international trade as much as basically they're only disrupting the trade that goes to Israel, including oil and gas. So I don't see oil and gas prices, including basically LNG, flaring up for a longer time unless another geopolitical stress happens. That's the first thing. The second thing is that those prices also are linked to supply and demand. So unless OPEC plus, we're not talking about OPEC and at one point or another has been merged indirectly with OPEC plus. So unless there's a decision made by OPEC plus states to cut back on oil that's going into the market, we're not going to see any play up in those prices. And it's not in anybody's best interest to create that kind of volatility in the market at the time being, not even the Americans.
And also, Leila, as well, we wanted to ask you onto the subject of the axis of resistance, because you mentioned Hassan Nasrallah, the recent speech as well. Did you get a chance to listen to it, and what were some of the key takeaway points that you picked up that you think are important?
Well, for me, there were three takes. The first one is that there will be no ceiling or no margins, which means everybody is a fair game. Every interest for those who are not only supporting the Israeli occupation, but also the Israeli occupation itself, everything that they own, that they have interest in across the region will be a fair game. And it's not only Hezbollah that's going to retaliate, it's also the other fronts because they have been unified. The second point is that they are ready for war and they're not intimidated. They're not going to back off. And any claim by the US that they are afraid for Lebanon of what might happen to it if the Israelis actually attack Lebanon, it's in fact, according to Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, it's all a lie by the Americans. They're not afraid for Lebanon. They're afraid for their own best interest of what's happening later on, what's going to happen later on to them if that front actually opens. And at the end of the day, the main line that he actually stressed on is that they are unified. So that means all the fronts are talking to each other. He actually highlighted it in the past speech. Today's speech was short. He was giving a word during the weekly commemoration of the death of the assassination of one of their leaders on the front, Hassan Tawil, who was assassinated by the Israelis over a week ago, actually. So you have to understand, in Islam, there's the 3-day memorial and there's the 1-week memorial. So he gave that speech during the 1-week memorial of Mr. Tawil's assassination. He literally said, one, all fronts are united and they are demanding the ceasefire on Gaza, and after that we will talk. You cannot go and negotiate with us unless you stop attacking Gaza. Second one, we are prepared for war. We have been preparing for that for the past 99 days, and at the same time there will be no ceilings and no margins for us. 3, American interests in the region will be targeted, not only the Israeli. So these are the 3 main points that he actually detailed.
And on the subject of axis of resistance, so Leila Hatoum is just giving us a summary of Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah's comments. I will also remark on that. Hezbollah has been very, let's say, pragmatic, extremely pragmatic, extremely precise on all of their sort of exchanges, interactions, statements. It's almost, Leila, if you were another country, if you were Russia or China or another world power, you're looking at Hezbollah, you're looking at their leadership, how they're conducting themselves militarily, and you're thinking to yourself, they're a very predictable world actor on the world stage. They're behaving like a normative power, unlike Israel is behaving, unlike the United States, who are completely unpredictable, change their mind every 5 minutes, don't ever comply to any agreements, and don't really respect proportionality when it comes to exchanges. So are we seeing Hezbollah emerging as a very credible force on the world stage through this latest crisis?
I was going to say this is what gives them credibility. It's not that they are predictable, it's the fact that they actually stick to the word that they give in terms of how they fight, in terms of who they fight, what they target, what they promise, and how they actually fulfill it. It might take time for them to fulfill a certain promise, but they fulfill it towards the end. They see it to the end. That's one thing. And this is why when Hezbollah Secretary General goes out and says something, even the Israelis and the Israeli public and the officials sit down there and listen to every single word he says, because he gives them the information that their own politicians don't give them. That's one thing. When it comes to threats, he doesn't give out threats out of void. He doesn't threaten something that he can't actually fulfill. Otherwise, he will lose his credibility, and Hezbollah will lose its credibility as well. They've been introducing, for example, new arms during this fight, the battle that we saw over the past 99 days along the blue line and between the settlements and southern Lebanon. You've seen half a ton missiles being used. You've seen them reaching not only the northern command ship, but also the eye in the sky, the air defense system in Miron that's outside Safad. So it's beyond the 8-kilometer range. So that means they can actually build on that and much more, and they can hit longer distances inside Israel. And this is what the Israelis are afraid of. At the end of the day, you have to understand, I had told you about the 12 soldiers that were killed in Gaza, but today also an Israeli soldier was killed along the northern front, which is South Lebanon, in Kfar Yuval. And this person who was killed, the soldier who was killed, actually there were one soldier killed and 3 others were injured. The 3 others that were injured were not announced by the Israelis. Only one soldier was announced, and those were hit by smaller missiles by Hezbollah. Hezbollah had said that we have more weapons, so just wait for surprises. They are really good in terms of the psychological warfare. So even though they are predictable, as you say, or they are credible and they maintain their promise, however, they always keep something in the back pocket that they don't tell everybody else. And this is what creates the balance of terror between them and the Israeli occupation. And that's why Israel hasn't changed its behavior towards Lebanon for the past 99 days. They could have easily hit Sidon city or all the way down to Beirut or other areas in Lebanon. However, when Nasrallah came out in his first speech and he said, if the Israelis change their behavior towards Lebanon, in terms basically of attacking certain parts of Lebanon, that means we are not deterred from expanding that front. And this would lead basically going forward to an expanded front. The Israelis tried to push Hezbollah by assassinating its people, by assassinating Sheikh Saleh al-Arawi, Hamas's main lead in Lebanon. And they failed to actually push Hezbollah to expand that front for a reason. They weren't attacking Hezbollah, they were attacking somebody from Hamas. That did not constitute a change in behavior. However, now they're trying to push for that, and Hezbollah said it's ready. In that speech that Nasrallah gave today, it literally indicates we are ready for war. You either take it to a full escalation and everybody's interest will be hit, or you do a ceasefire and then we can talk.
Well, so that's a fairly clear offer, and I think any state, any reasonable government can read that and understand what's on the table, and each side has to decide what they're willing to sacrifice, what they're willing to risk. And certainly Israel has quite a lot to risk in terms of military infrastructure. So as you mentioned before, the Mount Meron destruction of that base, that is very significant in terms of communications, not just in Israel, but also for the region, because isn't it true, Leila, that base links up with the Five Eyes intelligence sharing complex with Cyprus, with the British and the American. They rely on these hubs, don't they? And now a major leg is disabled there. And so I think that is extremely significant. What next? Air bases, other communication hubs in Israel? What are they risking here by pushing the envelope with Hezbollah on this, Leila?
When the Israelis threatened Lebanon by saying we have targets inside Lebanon that we can reach, at the beginning of this war, Hezbollah came out and said, and we do have targets as well. And that doesn't include only the majority of the infrastructure in Rosh Dan, which basically is the epicenter of the Israeli entity itself, but it also includes chemical factories. Remember, in 2006, Hezbollah intentionally targeted next to one of the chemical factories in Rosh Dan. And they told the Israelis, we could have easily hit it, but we're trying to safeguard the civilian lives living next to that area. This time, Nasrallah said there will be no ceiling and no margins to stop us or deter us from the next attack. So it's up to the Israelis to see basically if he's bluffing or not. And for the past 20 years, he never bluffed. So it's up to them to decide either a ceasefire and go to talks, because you have to understand, Nasrallah also said in the speech, and he repeated it in past speeches, he said, we entered this war to support Gaza and the ceasefire. If that doesn't happen, we're willing to go into war. So the whole thing literally lies on the shoulders of the Americans, who are controlling everything according to Nasrallah, and to the Israelis to back off and do a ceasefire if they actually want to safeguard themselves and their interests. Otherwise, basically, everybody's ready for war, and the biggest loser is the person who loses patience first.
So Yousef, what Leila just laid out there from Hezbollah, their position, and how they're interacting with Israel, it's not very different from what Ansar Allah has placed on the table as well. Structurally, it's the same. So we're seeing a kind of very much a consistency of the messaging, a consistency of the diplomacy, a consistency of the military strategy towards Israel with these different actors in the axis of resistance, but mainly we're talking about Hezbollah and Yemen here. So what does this mean in terms of, I know I want to get your opinion on this. I know Leila's also commented on this extensively in the past about what is the level of coordination among the members of the axis of resistance? What's your understanding of that? Go ahead, Yousef.
So, first of all, I want to thank Leila for clearly articulating what exactly is happening and providing people with deeper insight and perspective on the overall situation and what the conflict currently stands and where it could lead in the near future. I want to mention that when Israel decided to launch this offensive on Gaza, their mission wasn't just to get rid of Hamas and occupy Gaza only. They did this with the full intent of starting a regional war by first getting rid of Hamas and the Palestinian resistance fighters, taking full control of Gaza, and then right away declaring war on Lebanon's Hezbollah, and then getting rid of that enemy. And they need to get rid of Hamas first before they can wage a full-scale war against Lebanon's Hezbollah, because they don't want to wage a war against Hezbollah while they're still dealing with what they presume to be an internal front in Gaza. So they get rid of Hamas, and then they attempt to get rid of Hezbollah, and then guess what? They declare war on the Syrian factions, and then eventually they're declaring war on Iran. The whole purpose, the whole plan of this has been crafted and orchestrated for many, many years, even before the Arab Spring ever happened. Their plan is to get rid of the axis of resistance and to cut off the head of the axis of resistance, which is why Israel is constantly on a monthly base pressuring Western powers, pressuring the US to declare war on Iran. Something happened, though, that Israel and the US weren't expecting in the midst of this venture to get rid of the axis of resistance, to get rid of the resistance movements in Gaza and Lebanon. Yemen happened. They weren't expecting the Red Sea to be cut off from all Israeli-linked ships. They didn't think Yemen was bold enough to take such a military initiative. And it was a bold move. Nobody expected it. We haven't witnessed these types of actions, this type of historic defiance in the face of Western powers, in the face of this bully that nobody dares stand up to. So that threw their whole program, their entire calculation into a frenzy. Well, now how are they going to deal with Hamas, wage war on Hezbollah, so they can eventually wage war on Iran when their economy is taking a devastating blow from the Red Sea, when their ships, their most precious economic resource is being cut off? In order for Israel to prolong or to continue this war against the axis of resistance, not just Hamas, they need a full thriving economy, and they just simply don't have that with Ansar Allah cutting off their lifeline from Bab el-Mandeb. And not only that, it also poses a threat, and also lets the U.S. know that yes, the U.S.'s partnership and their constant support, their continual support of the Israeli regime. What if pretty soon Ansar Allah, they add American-linked ships and British-linked ships to the blacklist from the Red Sea? That could also throw the entire Western economy into another recession. So this was, what happened in Yemen and the operations in the Red Sea targeting the Israeli-linked ships was not part of the script that they were going by. And like I said, I think you can see through Netanyahu's statements that he fully intends on waging war against Lebanon, Hezbollah, and I'm sure that Leila can attest to that. But if they achieve their goals, and I don't think it's likely, but if they achieve their goals of getting rid of the Hezbollah movement in Lebanon, I think the next war they're going to wage is against Iran. However, things are working backwards now. It is actually Israel is bearing the brunt of the heavy losses. Their whole military strategy was built upon levitating the entirety of Gaza so that they can move their troops in to occupy Gaza. However, Hamas resistance Palestinian fighters, their whole strategy of war and war tactics was built upon Israeli forces going into Gaza so they can pop off from underground and wage all-out hell on them. And that's exactly what's happening. We see them, we see the videos, and I'm sure you've all seen the videos of Israeli tanks just, getting hit from every single direction. When you add to the mix being cut off from the international shipping route in Bab el-Mandeb, and then you have Hassan Nasrallah basically declaring today that the axis of resistance is in full power, is in full swing right now, and that the axis of resistance is ready for war. This is definitely proving to be a huge disturbance to the international hegemonic architecture that they have been planning for many years. So yes, the axis of resistance is in full coordination with one another. In fact, the whole title of the flood of Al-Aqsa, before the flood of Al-Aqsa operations happened, Yemen's Ansar Allah movement, they held a parade, and the last missile that was on display was the biggest, most powerful missile. You know what the name of that missile was? Flood of Al-Aqsa. So yes, they are definitely in coordination with one another. And I think that coordination is only going to grow stronger, especially with Hamas winning the battle on the ground. And what I mean by that is Israel is failing to eliminate Hamas. And I think that's very obvious for everybody to see. The U.S. White House administration is very frustrated with the way Israel has been conducting the war, because at the end of the day, they're putting the U.S. in front of the car. There's a saying in the U.S. and they look like a deer with the headlights on, because the U.S. is bearing the brunt and the consequences of Israel's actions in the Middle East. Because now it is U.S. military bases that are being targeted in Iraq, in Syria, and pretty soon Yemen is going to start also targeting U.S. military bases in the region. So the U.S. at the end of the day is suffering because of Israel's actions. And guess what? They gave Israel a time frame. They're telling Israel, you basically have this amount of time to take over Gaza, eliminate Hamas, and go ahead, commit genocide if you will, but just get the job done. And they haven't been able to get that job done. On the contrary, the axis of resistance is actually getting stronger. The Palestinian cause is actually getting more support. Before this war started, the Palestinian cause was all but dead. Normalization deal was undergoing, and this normalization deal was specifically put there on purpose to expand an Israeli empire that would cut off the military options and the military options of the axis of resistance, right? And so that did not happen, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen any soon. If the U.S. was to be mindful and wanted to take the smarter approach, they would stop supporting Israel, and they would come to the realization of this new reality and the change in the environment across the world. And I think the U.S. should realize that it's better for them to end their support of genocide in Israel, to end their military occupation in the Middle East, and perhaps that's their best strategy going forward, unless they want World War III to be declared, unless they want to spark a regional war. And that's also a possibility.
Yousef, don't forget that the other miscalculation was not only Yemen, but it was also Iraq. The first time that the Islamic resistance in Iraq attacked a U.S. military base in Syria, they killed 5 American soldiers. We announced it the same day. The Americans waited until the next day, literally less than 24 hours later. The Americans said that they lost 5 soldiers in a routine flight over the Eastern Mediterranean. Those soldiers actually were killed by the Islamic resistance in Iraq when they attacked the American military base in Syria. And those attacks never stopped, which actually tells you the coordination between all these fronts fall in line with what Nasrallah is saying. They're saying that the U.S. interests in the region will be targeted. And he mentioned Syria, he mentioned Iraq, he mentioned Yemen, he mentioned Lebanon, he mentioned Palestine, and he said all over the Middle East. So at any point, they want to risk a war with Yemen, at the same time opening that front, northern Palestinian front, which is South Lebanon, while Hamas has not ended its fight yet as well. You have to understand the Iraqi resistance is also going to open that front. And how thin can the Americans and the Israelis and the British stretch themselves thin? Nobody knows. And don't forget that there might be sleeper cells, there might not be sleeper cells. But no matter what, I know from history, and Patrick, you can correct me on this one. You can correct me on this one. Not a single entity that went into war with Yemen ended up winning in that war. They always ended up losing or withdrawing without recording any victory. So at the end of the day, Yemen is one of the strongest fronts. I can call it basically is the kingmaker at the moment.
You know, one of the worst.
Yeah, go ahead, Yousef. Go ahead.
Just to add to what you were saying, when Saudi Arabia launched this coalition force to bomb Yemen, they announced that the Ansarullah Houthis will be defeated within a matter of 3 weeks. Within a matter of 3 weeks, and this was something they use these videos every now and then in Ansarullah media to show how dead wrong that prediction was. So yeah, definitely.
The Americans gave it 2 months. That was 6-7 years ago.
Sounds very familiar. Well, we'll talk. I want to comment on Hezbollah as well. Similar question to what I'm going to ask Yousef. Yousef, for the Western audience, when they look at the headlines or all coverage right now on this issue of Yemen, Bab el-Mandeb Straits, United States bombing Yemen, attacking Yemen with their coalition, the headline is always Iran-backed Houthis, or Iranian militias, or Iranian militants. So can you dispel this a little bit? Because to me, this is just a propaganda trope that gets copied and pasted. And we see this right across the board. The same with Hamas, the same with Hezbollah, Iranian backed, or the Iranian proxy, etc. Explain to people the genesis of Ansarullah's military capability over the last 8 years, because it has gone through a massive transformation. You now have the equivalent of Navy SEAL units. You now have TAC teams. You now have really effective strategic naval assets. You have also air assets. This is not the Yemen of 2015, is it? And just explain to people how this was done internally, and Yemen's ability to develop its own technology, its own missile tech, its own drone tech. I'm sure you get parts from around the world like everyone else does, but it is not assembled and created outside. It's done internally. Go ahead, Yousef. Explain the dynamic here.
So with regards to the rhetoric of Iranian-backed Houthis, first of all, we have to understand where this propaganda is coming from. It's coming from the Gulf nations, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and unfortunately, Islamic sects that oppose and try to fuel sectarian division amongst the ranks of the Muslims. The reason why they call them Houthi-backed, Iranian-backed Houthis is because that's the reality that they live in. The only way any group can be successful is if he's being financed or supported by an external power. For example, Saudi Arabia was established by the British government. It's the British-backed Saudis, constant, because they literally established the rule of the Saudi rulers, Saudi Arabia, and they're constantly dictating British foreign policy through the scope and through the execution of Saudi policies. And it's the same thing with every single regime in the Middle East, throughout the decades and decades of Western neo-colonial domination, all to be supported and taken orders from external forces. So when a new player came into action, they started pointing fingers that this is a group that's being financed from an external force, and that Iran is supporting the Houthis. It has to be Iranian support, because this is a group. Why else would this group mobilize? Why else would this group seek a revolution? But the fact of the matter is, the Ansarullah, or let's use that label, Houthis. The Houthis is a popular Yemeni tribe that has existed in Yemen for more than 800 years. And this is a family line. Like the leader of Ansarullah, Sayyid Abdel Malik al-Houthi, his brother was a scholar. His father was a scholar. His great-grandfather was a Zaydi scholar. The Houthi family are the ones who established the Zaydi Islamic ideology in Yemen 800 to 700 to 800 years ago in Yemen. So that was before any state of Iran ever existed. So you have the Houthis that have existed in Yemen and have a scholarly history in Yemen for more than 800 years. And for 800
we go here. I think we've lost the audio for Yousef. We'll try to get him back in a moment. So hold on for a second. So while we try to reconnect Yousef on that, Leila, same goes for Hezbollah. Same goes for Hezbollah. Iranian proxy, Iranian-backed terrorist group. For the Western audience, explain and dispel this propaganda trope in the most concise way that you can. Go ahead, Leila.
You have to understand, I worked for international media for a really long time, and even regional media. So I had to, at one point or another, use the word proxy to explain it in simpler terms for the Western audience who wouldn't understand anything in any different way, because this is how they were conditioned by their own media to understand things. So if somebody is basically funding, let's say Iran is funding Hezbollah, it's funding Hamas, it's funding, let's say, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, or even the Yemenis, training them or supplying them with weapons, then basically de facto in the population, the Western population's mind, that's a proxy for that country. However, I did explain several times in the past that I was proud of Hamas. They were basically receiving funds from the Muslim Brotherhood. They were receiving training and some military techniques from the Iranians. However, they never listened to the dictations of the Iranians or Hamas. The pure decision on the ground was by Palestinians in Gaza. At the same time, the timing of an attack or how they create their alliances was always a Palestinian-made decision. Same thing goes for Hezbollah. I mean, at the end of the day, yes, they were trained by Iran. They are funded by Iran, and they openly say it. I mean, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah actually said it several times in his past speeches that, yes, we are funded by Iran. They give us money. And at the same time, they give them weapons and training. However, at the end of the day, when the decision comes to opening a certain front, it's not up to Iran or anybody else. Because at the end of the day, the fighters on the ground are Hezbollah fighters, and the ones that are being attacked or retaliation happens, it retaliates against their own families who are living in South Lebanon and across Lebanon. So they have to think twice before they carry out a dictation by somebody else. So in that sense, they are not a proxy as much as basically they are patroned by Iran in terms of supplying them with financing and training. At the end of the day, there might be some political decision-making that aligns with the same narrative or viewpoint that Iran sees. However, that doesn't mean a full dictation or a proxy. And this is what is very clear, like people need to understand when it comes to Western audience.
No, thank you for that. That's a good basic explainer there, and I think it's one of the things that I think mainstream media especially falls down pretty hard on is on this issue, and I think this is a huge handicap in the West, Leila, because and I think the same could be said with Yemen and Ansar Allah, is that politicians are basically getting this same problem from the press. They read those articles, that forms their worldview. So if the politicians making the policies in London, in Washington, are getting these propaganda tropes that aren't actually representative of the actual political situation in Lebanon or in Yemen or other countries, in Iraq with the Hashid as well, zero understanding of any of it, how can they possibly form any foreign policy or military strategy if their idea of the region, of the people, of the political structures doesn't correspond with reality at all? This is a huge problem. Do you think this is one of the reasons why the policies are a little bit schizophrenic, to say the least? What are your thoughts on that phenomenon?
Well, it's either that or they're basically rolling the dice to know what they need to do basically on the ground. This is how they're taking decisions. At the end of the day, you cannot make a decision purely based on your ignorance and just media. If you listen to everything that the media says, the media also has hidden agendas, and they are basically, they do have red lines, and they cover certain angles that actually pleases their own investors at the end of the day. So they're not going to give you all the truth. You have to actually have people from those areas, advising you. And when it comes to those people, you don't pick people who are of the same color as you. And I mean, in same mentality, not like the color of the skin. So you have to pick diverse ideas and listen to them before you actually go in. And you have to have lived in that area or have somebody lived in that area for the longest time, understands its culture and the background before you make a decision. That's the first thing. And I'm going to give you two different matters that were played by China and the West at the same time when it comes to the Middle East. The Chinese have moved in at one point or another, created bridges in terms of economic ties, and they never dictated the countries over here. And they're building those bridges slowly but surely to the extent that they managed to patron a peace agreement between the Saudis and the Iranians without even one single bullet being fired, or basically a dictation or order to any of those states. What was the result of that kind of cooperation? You have Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and even Egypt are now part of BRICS. So there are bonus points if you actually join us in that economic, peaceful way. You have to understand one thing. I'm not defending China. I'm just explaining how things are happening on the ground. On the other hand, the Americans come in, they do economic sanctions, they do threatening as much as they can, they do wars, they relinquish their own allies at one point at will, and then basically they want them to come back running to them. Like, their allies are not dogs. Dogs are the only faithful animals or creatures on earth. You throw them away, and then when you call them, they come back. You have to understand, Arabs are very proud people. The Middle Easterners are very proud people. You don't toss them like a boomerang and expect them to come back. That's the first thing. You have to respect them. You have to establish ties based on respect, not hegemony. Unfortunately, the colonial mindset that have ruled this region for hundreds of years in the past does not work now. The population of this region have waken up, and you have to deal with them in a different way. Yes, you do have preset agendas and foreign policies that you have been planning for years and years and trying to set up over here, but it's not going to work going forward. You have to understand the mindset of the people. Eras change, and they have to change their ways as well. You don't dictate. You actually have to deal with people as equals or as friends. You don't deal with them as servants.
No, that is definitely a sea change in the region. The region has changed. It's a new Middle East, but not the new Middle East that Condoleezza Rice was thinking about a few years ago. It's very different, and I really think that a lot of people in Washington are ignorant to this. They haven't adjusted. They haven't updated their software. They're still running, Windows 97.
It's pure arrogance. I mean, at the end of the day, not everybody has the hegemony or the strength that they used to have in the past. You either cooperate, or basically you will be losing new markets, and you'll be losing your old allies as well.
No, that is for certain, and you're going to get yourself embroiled into situations that you really didn't need to be embroiled in the first place. So this is what we're seeing shaping up right now. Let's hope that common sense prevails. Let's hope that smart people will come forward in Washington, in London, maybe even in Tel Aviv. Who knows? Miracles happen sometimes. And we can see a de-escalation. We can see the ceasefire that everybody is asking for, an end to the genocide, and somehow some way forward in this incredible situation that, quite frankly, it doesn't look like Israel is going to recover from very easily in the future. The Palestinians will also struggle to recover, but they eventually will, because they've been doing it now for a very long time. So time is not on Israel's side. Time is not on Washington's side on this politically. So I think that's an important point to underline there. Leila Hatoum, veteran journalist based in the Middle East. We really appreciate you joining us on the Sunday Wire Live today for this extended analysis.
Thank you for your time.
And also a big thank you to Yousef Mawry as well, from the capital in Yemen, Sana'a. He unfortunately had to go, but we really appreciate his contribution that he gave us for this extended analysis, a deep dive on the situation in Yemen, also with Palestine as well, how all this fits together. This is what we're trying to bring to you here at this program, and we really appreciate your support. We're going to break right now to ACR. So if you're watching us on the video screen, we'll move over to the audio stream now with the Alternate Current Radio Network and do our final segment of Overdrive. But I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. I appreciate you guys coming along for the ride today. This has been a great broadcast on X platform. We've also gone out on YouTube, also on Facebook on our fan page at Facebook as well. So thank you very much for joining us, and stick around on the audio streams at the Sunday Wire. Jump over to 21stcenturywire.com. Just click on the link, which you'll see in our feeds, and I'll take you to the audio stream. We'll see you guys in a few minutes. All the best, and thank you to our guests again. This has been a fantastic broadcast.